And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving into today's sea ice analysis, there we go. Those strong northerly winds, cold air has brought the thinner ice down to just north of St. Paul Island again. And as usual, when it gets close to the island there, the pattern changes. It looks like tomorrow afternoon, winds are going to go southerly there after diminishing tonight and dropping off. So it doesn't look like much in the way of any ice will reach the pergolofs here on this round anyway. So moving on to the forecast for tonight, low pressure, areas of snow, south central Alaska, rain or snow, North Gulf Coast, and snow up over the Arctic coast north slope with a widespread area of snow showers over the interior areas. But drying out along the coast, stays windy on the west coast here, but additional snow about ends. Next front pushing into the west. Bulk of the energy pushing off to the northeast there with a weaker trailing edge down into the central Aleutians tomorrow. And another system brings mostly rain, more of a rain than wind producer here for the southeast coast. And gusty north winds, colder temperatures finally pushing into south central Alaska. Cold and mostly clear with lighter winds out to the west. And then for Tuesday, big storm moves into the northwest Bering Sea. Strong winds push that front and right up in toward the southwest coast for snow and blowing snow developing there for St. Lawrence Island down to Nunivak Island. Rain, wind for the Alaska Peninsula. High pressure, dry conditions, a lot of sunshine in the central interior, but still mostly cloudy with areas of light snow to the north and east. And this low center, mostly to the south now, just west of the Queen Charlotte, is probably going to nudge some rain up into the southern panhandle. And coastal water forecasts. South to southeast winds, 20 knots for the outer coastline tomorrow. Central coast, southeast 15 to 20, and east winds at 20 knots on the north coast. Central northern inner channel, south winds 15 knots. Southern inside water, southeast at 15. And about the same on Tuesday, south to southeast winds at 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot seas for the inside waters. South coast, west to southwest 15 knots. Central coast, west to southwest 15 knots. And the north coast, east to south winds at 10 knots. Cook Inlet tomorrow, north winds 10 to 20 knots. Good gales for Kamishak Bay. Northwest 40 knots, 35 knots out of the northwest for the Barren Islands. Southwest 15 for the western North Gulf Coast. Small craft advisories, Prince William Sound, east winds 25 knots, and those seas expected at about 6 feet. East to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. For Tuesday, north to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots for Cook Inlet. Still carrying gales here for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Northwest at 35 knots, seas just under 10 feet. Northwest at 15 for for Prince William Sound, and north to northwest winds at 15 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 30 knots, seas 6 to 7 feet. Northwest winds 30 knots with 7-foot seas also for Bristol Bay. Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for Tuesday, Alaska Peninsula winds switch direction here, and south to southeast 20 to 30 knots, east to 20 for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island west-southwest winds 20 to 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, tomorrow for Unalaska Island, northwest 25 to 30 knots, out toward Nikolsky, southwest at 30 knots. Adak and Atka, south winds 30 knots. That extends all the way to Kiska Island, and then from Kiska to Shimia, southwesterlies at 30 knots with 14-foot seas. Then with that big storm coming in out here, look for good storm force winds, 55 to 60 knots here for the western Aleutians, and gales on the increase for Adak and Atka as well, 40 to 45 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings, south to southwest winds, 35 to 40 knots. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, northwesterlies 20 to 30 knots, strongest south of Nunivak Island. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, brisk wind advisories, northwest winds 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, southeast winds 30 knots. Variable at 25 knots. That's what's in the forecast anyway for the Pribilof Islands. And for Tuesday, southwest winds 30 knots there for the Pribilof Islands, and that'll push that ice edge back to the north and northeast. Southeast 35 knots, St. Matthew Island. Southwest coast, 30 to 40 knot winds out of the southeast, southeast 25 St. Lawrence Island, and about 20 knots for Norton Sound. For the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, west at 20 knots for the western Arctic coast, east at 10 for the central coast, then back around to the west at 20 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And the east side on Tuesday, looking at west winds at 15 knots, west at 20 for the central Arctic coast, southwest 20 for the west side here in the Chukchi Sea, south-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots.